The Jenkins farm wasn't what you'd call efficient. It was more improvised. A rusted red barn, a squeaky old tractor that only started if you threatened it with a wrench, and a field of corn that grew faster than the couple who owned it could keep up with. Martha and Earl Jenkins had been farming together for over 30 years. They'd survived floods, droughts, and one unfortunate incident involving a turkey and a snowblower. But nothing prepared them for the chaos of this year's corn harvest. And certainly not for Ginger. Ginger was a goat. But not just any goat. She was trouble wrapped in fur and attitude, part escape artist, part field supervisor, and entirely too smart for anyone's peace of mind. She had a habit of chewing on Earl's boots, climbing onto the roof of the shed for better views, and somehow always appearing in the exact spot you didn't want her to be. The trouble began on a Tuesday, a very hot, very sticky, very corn-heavy Tuesday. Martha stood in the middle of the field, sun hat flapping in the wind, trying to wrangle an overloaded wheelbarrow full of ears. Earl, 20 feet away, was stuck trying to unjam the tractor again, muttering words that probably shouldn't be repeated near polite company. "Earl," Martha shouted, "you said the tractor was fixed." "It was fixed," he shouted back, banging the engine with a wrench. "It just forgot." From the edge of the field, Ginger watched, head tilted, eyes gleaming. She wasn't chewing grass. She was calculating. And then, without warning, she sprang into action, straight toward the corn pile. "What in the Ginger?" Martha hollered as the goat launched herself onto the wheelbarrow like a pirate claiming a ship. Corn flew everywhere. Martha stumbled back. Earl dropped his wrench. Ginger let out one proud bleat and began eating everything. It was, objectively, a disaster, but it was only the beginning. Because while Ginger looked like a walking catastrophe, she was about to become the most unexpected hero the Jenkins farm had ever seen. The days that followed were a mess. Corn season waited for no one, and the Jenkinses were falling behind. Earl finally got the tractor running, but only in reverse. Martha's back was aching from hauling baskets, and every time they turned their heads, Ginger was somewhere she absolutely should not be. Day 1, she chewed through the twine holding the harvested corn together. Day 2, she headbutted the gate to the grain bin open and rolled in it like it was a mud spa. Day 3, she climbed onto the tractor while it was moving. Earl swore she had a schedule, but no matter how much trouble she caused, Ginger never ran away. She always returned. She'd appear at Martha's side when her hands trembled from the weight of a basket. She'd nudge Earl's boot when he sat too long in the sun, lost in a daze. And at night, when they slumped onto the porch, sore and sunburned, she'd curl up at their feet like a farmhand, clocking out after a long shift. "She's got nerve, that one," Martha muttered one evening. "She's got something," Earl sighed, tossing her a half-shucked cob. Ginger caught it midair. But then came the Thursday incident, the one that nearly ended everything. It started with a thunderstorm, not the loud kind, the sneaky, heavy kind that rolls in quiet, soaks the ground, and turns your fields into pudding. The Jenkinses had harvested nearly a quarter acre the day before, and all of it, every last basket, sat piled high at the edge of the lower field, where the runoff ran straight downhill. They realized it too late. Martha screamed first. "The corn!" They sprinted. Earl slipped in the mud. Martha tripped over a rake. Ginger beat them both there. And what they saw froze them. Half the harvest, gone, washed down the slope, scattered, drenched, doomed. But Ginger, she wasn't panicking. She was gathering. One by one, she dragged ears of corn out of the mud with her teeth, dropped them in a pile, ran back, dragged more. She worked faster than either of them could believe. Hooves slipping, coat soaked, eyes focused. No chaos now, no bleeding, just purpose. Earl stood there, mouth open. She's saving the corn." Martha blinked, chest heaving. "She's outworking us." By sundown, they had rescued almost 2/3 of it. Not all perfect, but salvageable. And Ginger? She lay beside the pile like a soldier at rest, covered in muck, chewing lazily, proud. That night, Earl placed a clean towel on the porch just for her. And Martha, she gave her a name. "Ginger," she said softly, scratching behind her ear. "You little miracle." The next morning, the Jenkinses didn't start the day alone. Ginger trotted beside them, waiting. Not for mischief, but for work. They gave her her own little harness. She carried baskets, guarded piles, nudged Martha when she looked too tired. Gently head-butted Earl every time he started talking to the corn again, like it was his therapist. And for the first time in weeks, the harvest started to look manageable. Neighbors began to notice. Is that goat working? She fetches the corn? She waits for commands? The Jenkinses didn't brag. They just smiled. Because Ginger wasn't just helping. She was reminding them why they loved this farm in the first place. Not for the crops, not for the work, but for what happened when you stayed long enough, through the mess, the mud, and the mayhem, to build something worth coming back to. And Ginger came back, every morning, before the sun touched the tops of the corn stalks, before Earl's coffee boiled over, before Martha found her hat tangled in the scarecrow's arm again. She was there, waiting, no leash, no fence, just a choice, to show up, to help, to belong. The Jenkinses didn't treat her like a pet anymore, not even like livestock. She had become something else, a partner, a presence, a little muddy miracle with sharp eyes and a softer heart than either of them had expected. And maybe that's what made it so special. It wasn't that she saved the corn, or figured out how to open the gate without help, or learned to fetch gloves from the barn, though impressively she did. It was that she chose them, every single day, even when the sky looked stormy, even when the mud was deep, even when they had nothing to offer her but tired smiles and cracked hands. She stayed. And in staying, she reminded them of something they had forgotten. That love, real love, doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to show up. And Ginger did, again and again and again. She was there when Martha accidentally spilled a full basket of cobs and just stood there sighing into the sky. Ginger trotted over, picked one up with her teeth, and dropped it at her feet like, "You done moping?" She was there when Earl's back gave out and he collapsed onto a haystack, groaning about getting too old for this nonsense. Ginger climbed right up beside him, plopped herself on his lap, mud, smell and all, and refused to move. "Guess I ain't the only stubborn one around here," Earl muttered, smiling despite himself. She was there when the harvest was finally done too, when the last ear of corn was stored, the baskets cleaned, and the tools hung. The field lay quiet, golden and stripped, waiting for frost. Martha leaned on Earl's shoulder. Earl leaned on the fence. And Ginger? She trotted to the middle of the field, spun in a circle, and dramatically flopped onto the dirt like she'd done all the work herself. They laughed so hard Martha had to sit down. That night, they gave her her own stall in the barn. Not that she used it. She preferred the porch, or the hay cart, or sleeping directly on Earl's boot. And from that season on, things changed. Not big changes, just better ones. The kind you don't notice until you realize you're laughing more. Until your back still hurts, but it hurts for something that feels worth it. Until you find yourself talking to a goat like she's your third farmhand. And listening, because she might actually be giving good advice. After all, who else but Ginger had the courage to headbutt Earl exactly when he started daydreaming about installing solar panels on the outhouse? Who else stared Martha down until she finally took her aching knees inside to rest? Who else refused to let either of them skip lunch just because there was too much to do? Ginger had her own rhythms now. She patrolled the field every morning, not for threats, but for out-of-place corn. She supervised every loading session with narrowed eyes and disapproving bleats. She stood guard during stormy nights just outside the barn, like a muddy sentinel with hay in her hair and loyalty in her bones. They never trained her. She just learned by being there, by watching, by caring. And maybe that was the best kind of help, the kind that didn't arrive in big declarations, but in small, stubborn gestures. The kind that chewed your hat, knocked over your rake, and then stood between you and the rain without expecting anything in return. That was Ginger's way. No expectations, no conditions, just presence. And somehow that became the rhythm of the farm. When things went wrong, and they always did, she was there. When things went right, she celebrated too. usually by stealing something bright and running in proud, joyful circles until someone laughed. The Jenkinses began measuring time differently. There was before Ginger, when they argued more and smiled less. And then there was after Ginger, when even bad days ended in a little laughter and good days felt like small miracles. Neighbors stopped by just to see her. Kids brought her sunflowers. One local reporter called her the goat that saved a harvest, though she ignored the attention and tried to eat his shoelace during the interview. But Martha and Earl knew the truth. Ginger hadn't just saved the corn. She'd saved something far more fragile, something you can't plant or pick, something you don't realize is slipping away until a muddy little creature comes along and stays. They had built their life on soil and sweat. Ginger had added something softer, something that made even the hard days feel like part of a story worth telling. And they did tell it, to neighbors over picket fences, to the mailman who stopped staying in his truck just to pet Ginger, to the seed salesman who started bringing extra corn for her as a bribe. But the most beautiful part, they told it to each other. At dusk, when the fields glowed gold and the work was finally done, Martha and Earl would sit side by side on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching Ginger chase shadows or chew on things she shouldn't. And one of them would say, "Remember when she ate the tax documents?" Or, "Remember when she dragged the scarecrow into the barn like it owed her money?" And they would laugh, not just at what happened, but at how much lighter everything felt because of her. Even the silences between them changed. They were no longer filled with worry or weariness. They were filled with something warmer, like rest, like relief, like knowing they had built a life that, while far from perfect, had become something deeply, beautifully enough. And Ginger? She didn't understand the words, but she understood the feeling. She curled beside them, leaned into their legs, and let the quiet wrap around all three of them like a soft, familiar quilt. It wasn't always laughter after that. Some days were still hard. The tractor still broke down. The rain still ruined perfectly good hay. Earl still misplaced his glasses, usually on his own head, and Martha still had mornings where her bones ached before she even opened her eyes. But even on those days, Ginger was there, sometimes just sitting, sometimes causing small chaos, sometimes doing absolutely nothing at all. And somehow, that was the most healing part. She didn't fix everything. She didn't have to. She just made it all feel more bearable, less lonely, less frustrating, less silent. Because silence, when shared with someone who chooses to stay, becomes something else entirely. It becomes peace. And so, the Jenkins farm kept going. Not smoother, not neater, but truer. Each crooked fence, each muddy boot print, each half-eaten corn cob left suspiciously near the porch became part of a rhythm, a story, one they never meant to write, but now couldn't imagine their lives without. They didn't try to. Ginger was simply part of things. When guests came over, she greeted them like a hostess. When a delivery truck pulled in, she inspected the boxes. When Earl fell asleep on the porch with a book on his chest, she stood guard, unless the book had paper that smelled interesting. Martha started baking 2 extra biscuits every morning, one for Earl, one for Ginger, and Ginger knew it too. She waited by the oven, bleeding once if Martha forgot the timer. The years passed like that, harvest after harvest, storm after storm. Winters where Ginger's fur puffed up so wide she looked like a wool blanket with legs. Summers where she'd nap under the tractor as if it had never once almost run her over. And through it all, the Jenkinses aged. Not sadly, not quickly, but gently, with the kind of aging that comes from knowing you're not doing it alone. Sometimes neighbors would ask, "Don't you ever want a break? A vacation?" And Earl would just shake his head. "What would we do without Ginger?" he'd say. "She runs the place." And Martha would smile, brushing hay from her skirt. "She is the place." Because after a while, Ginger wasn't just part of the farm. She was part of what made it feel alive, part of what made it feel like home. Not because she was always there, but because when she was, everything just felt right. There was something about her pacing near the porch every morning, about the sound of her hooves tapping the wooden planks, about the way she always stood between them during arguments like a four-legged mediator who refused to take sides. She knew the layout of the field better than Earl. She could predict rain better than the weatherman, and she could sense when Martha's knees were bothering her before even Martha could admit it. On cold evenings, Ginger would lie by the stove, close enough for warmth, but far enough to pretend she didn't care. On hard days, she'd bring odd gifts, an old glove, a pine cone, once even Earl's lost wedding ring, dug up from beneath a pile of straw as if to say, "You're welcome, old man." And on quiet nights, she'd rest her chin on Martha's lap without a sound, just breathing, just being. No tricks, no noise, just the comfort of a creature who had chosen to stay. That choice, silent, consistent, unquestioned, became the heartbeat of the farm. You could feel it in the way Earl walked a little straighter when Ginger followed behind him, her hooves tapping out a rhythm like faith made audible. You could see it in the way Martha hummed as she worked, not for the task, but for the company. And you could sense it in the air, in that strange, almost sacred quiet that settles over a place where nothing extraordinary has to happen, because the ordinary has already become precious. Ginger didn't need attention. She didn't need praise. She just was, like sunlight warming the porch steps, like the old oak that never bloomed too early, but never failed to shade the kitchen window, like the hum of the barn fan in summer, slow and steady and always there when you needed it. Over time, the Jenkinses stopped talking about training Ginger. They started listening instead, to where she stood, to what she nudged, to what she ignored. And in that listening, something inside them softened. They weren't just tending crops anymore. They were tending love, the quiet kind. The kind that didn't ask for anything, but somehow gave everything back. Not in money, not in more acres harvested, but in moments. Moments they hadn't realized they were missing until Ginger gave them back. Like the morning Earl stopped midway through a chore just to watch the sunrise, Ginger at his side, both of them still, like time had finally learned to be kind. Like the afternoon Martha sat in the dirt, laughing so hard she couldn't breathe, because Ginger had stolen Earl's hat and refused to give it back unless it was traded for a biscuit. They began to measure days not by what got done, but by how much joy had quietly bloomed in between. And that joy, it lingered. It lingered in Earl's hands, even when they were calloused and tired. It lingered in Martha's eyes, even when she stared into the field and saw more memories than corn. It lingered in the walls of the barn, the porch steps, the creaky kitchen door, as if the wood itself remembered laughter. And Ginger? She never asked them for more. She never demanded they notice what she was doing. But every night, without fail, she settled in the same spot, between them, a warm, solid presence. And somehow that simple act made everything feel complete, because it reminded them that wholeness wasn't always loud. It wasn't a grand achievement. It was a chair that never went empty. It was the sound of hooves just outside the window. It was knowing, without checking, that someone else would show up for the day, no matter what the day brought. It was Ginger. It was the way she walked the fence line each morning, as if counting the world into order. The way she laid her head on Earl's lap during thunderstorms, not because she was afraid, but because he might be. The way she followed Martha around the garden and sat like a statue beside the tomatoes, daring the birds to try something. There was no ceremony to it, no spotlight, no music swelling in the background. Just life shared, just time softened, just love made visible. And in that quiet, unfinished way, the days stitched themselves together. Not perfect, not polished, but true, because Ginger was there, and that was enough. Enough to make the farm feel less like a chore and more like a rhythm. Less like a burden and more like a song only three of them knew how to hum. They stopped chasing after big plans, stopped worrying about what others thought success should look like. Because what they had, muddy boots, slow mornings, shared silences, felt more honest than anything they could have planned. And Ginger? She never changed much. She still stole things, still climbed places she shouldn't, still bleated at empty buckets as if deeply betrayed. But she stayed. And because she stayed, so did they. In spirit, in heart, in presence. Not just on the farm, but with each other, fully, softly, unapologetically. Even the corn seemed to grow easier that way. Maybe it was the calm, maybe it was the laughter, or maybe it was just what happens when a place feels loved. Down to the soil. The rows weren't straighter, the tools weren't newer, but the hands that worked the land were steadier, and the hearts behind them lighter. Birds nested closer to the farmhouse. The old apple tree near the barn bloomed fuller that spring, and even the wind, when it passed through the fields, seemed to whisper thank you instead of hurry up. They began to notice things they used to rush past. The way Ginger always paused at the same spot in the field, as if remembering something. The way the sun hit the kitchen window just right in late afternoon, casting golden light across the same 3-chip mugs they used every single day. And in all of it, in the stillness, the mess, the miracles, was Ginger. Never asking, never claiming. Just walking quietly through their days, carving her shape into their story, until it was impossible to separate the two. You couldn't talk about the farm without mentioning her, not because she demanded space, but because her presence had quietly become the glue holding everything together. She was in the path worn smooth between the barn and the porch. In the bent gate latch, she learned how to nudge open. In the faint scent of hay that lingered on Earl's coat even after he changed. In the way Martha still set out 3 biscuits every morning, even when Ginger wasn't hungry. Some things had changed. Time, mostly. The fields were a little quieter now. The harvest a little slower. The porch creaked more under tired feet, and the days didn't stretch as long as they once did. But still, Ginger stayed. Maybe not always in sight, but always in step, in rhythm, in memory. Because some lives don't just pass through yours, they weave into it, thread by thread, until they're part of the pattern, unmistakable, unremovable. And maybe that's what love really is. Not something loud, but something lasting. Something you carry long after the hoofprints have faded. There would still be signs. In the tiny indent on the porch stair where she used to nap. In the corner of the barn where nothing ever quite stayed clean, because that had been her spot. In the worn leather strap Earl never threw away, chewed nearly in half, but too full of memory to be discarded. When visitors came by, they saw a tidy farm, neat rows of corn, a weathered couple who moved slower now but smiled quicker. But what they didn't see was what the Jenkinses still felt, that the land held more than roots, that silence wasn't empty anymore, that somewhere, somehow, a goat-shaped echo still walked the fields in the rhythm of every morning breeze. They no longer needed her to be seen, because they saw her in everything, in the soft sighs at sunrise, in the way Earl still mumbled aloud when working, as if expecting someone to interrupt him with a bleat, in how Martha sometimes looked out the window and whispered, "I set out your biscuit anyway." Ginger had not disappeared. She had just become part of the land, part of their habits, part of the peace that now bloomed in places once filled with rush and ache. They never built a statue, never hung a sign or wrote a plaque, but if you stood still long enough, on the porch at dawn, or beside the barn when the wind turned soft, you might feel her. In the hush between breaths, in the comfort of knowing something once stayed when it didn't have to. And that somehow that staying changed everything. If this story made you smile, share it with someone who still believes in small miracles.